Welcome to the Trad Dads podcast, where we examine cultural and political issues through the lens of traditional thought.
All right, thanks for joining me. It's just me, Levi Russell, today. And I wanted to talk about this issue of buying local. A few weeks ago, we had a debate on our campus between me and one of my colleagues about the concept of buy local. And we often think about we have Thanksgiving, and then we have uh, the Black Friday, where all these retailers, start to make money for the year. And then the day after that is Small Business Saturday. And so you may not know this, but you're encouraged to um, reach out to your local businesses and shop there, and just support the community. And the economics profession, in large part, I wouldn't say everyone, but a large part of the economics profession really um, goes hard against this idea. And I think it's with good intentions. It's from a sort of heartfelt belief that voluntary trade is the most important thing, and that it's very much from an individualist perspective in terms of philosophy and right. But it boils down to wealth creation and the idea that if you trade from one place to another, then you can have specialization, and that specialization makes everyone better off in a material sense. Which all of that is perfectly fine. If I would say if the only thing you're really concerned about is the average level of income in the area. And so the first thing that I would say, I think there's kind of two components to this, and I'm going to address them in separately. So first, I want to talk about sort of in theory. So what might be some theoretical problems with thinking about buying local this way, and then separately from that, how would we deal with the practical reality that we find ourselves in? And so the first thing I would say is that yes, specialization gives you more income, and if you've ever had an economics course or anything like that, you've probably seen uh, some kind of little example where they say, one person produces this many apples and this many oranges, and the other produces more of one and less of the other. And we see that if they specialize, then they can both have more of both apples and oranges. And that's true as far as it goes. But I would say that when we're talking about real world communities, and we're kind of wanting to introduce other theoretical elements that should be brought to bear on this thing, the first thing is just risk. Um, it's not always the case that a business in your local area is just sort of a direct competitor with a business in another area. And the example I used in the debate is that of a jewelry store. And so, obviously, if you're buying jewelry for your wife or whatever, um, you can very easily go on the internet to some of these big um, jewelry retailer websites. You can go to Amazon. Um, you can drive to a town far away from you, or somewhat nearby, that has a larger store or something like that. Or you can go to your local shop if you have one. And if you're just thinking about purchasing that product, then um, it's probably equally serviceable to go to, the internet, or a store far away, or the one downtown. And so then in that case, you might think that, well, I should just shop for the lowest price, or, their greatest selection, or whatever. But the problem is that when you find yourself in a situation where things aren't going right. So let's say, it's your anniversary, and your wife breaks her necklace, her favorite necklace, and it's like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? So if you have a local store, then you can go there and have that necklace repaired. But not so if you have to ship it off to one of these online stores, to their little place where they fix stuff, you know, probably at least 4 or 5 days to ship it out and get it back. And the the store in the next town might be also quite inconvenient in that scenario. And so it might seem like a trite example, but the thing is that that can be applied to so many other types of examples that are maybe more important. So, for instance, with a jewelry store, you're not worried about the cost of um, driving somewhere, really. It's not a trip you make very often. But if you're talking about grocery stores or something you frequent, um, then you really are concerned about travel time. And if you suddenly all of a sudden find yourself without reliable transportation, now all of a sudden the distances all of a sudden matter a lot more. And so it's this idea that when there's some kind of a downside risk in life, that is when we really need to be paying attention to the fact that something local is potentially a much better for us. Um, and again, it's not about the average. It's not about this theoretical idea that you can specialize and trade across borders. It's just this notion that sometimes bad things happen. So the next thing I would say in terms of looking at sort of some theoretical concepts that need to be dealt with. So the next one is just this idea, more of sort of a moral imperative. It's just this idea that you have a duty to support your family and, by extension, your community, because of course that community is also what helps support your family. Again, especially when things go wrong or when life is just more difficult than average. Um, and so, we have this idea that, the family is the basic unit of society. And, from a Catholic perspective, the, the family is, the, the smallest unit of the church too. Um, and so because we are duty bound to our family, we are also duty bound to, again, mitigate some of the risks and build something that is going to enrich our family, which is that community that we have. And certainly, you could live in one town and have all of your community in another. But especially, I think as Catholics, we have this idea of the parish. This is our location. This is our community where we live. And so I really have a problem with people who just sort of shop around to parish priests and stuff like that. It's just odd to me that you wouldn't just stay where you are. And so I think something that comes out of that very directly from an economic standpoint is just this idea of economies of scale. So a lot of things, hospitals, um, schools, and other services like this that require some kind of scale that cannot just be done on a very small, at a very small level. Um, Maybe at another time in the world, hospitals weren't really a thing 500 years ago. So maybe things were a little different. But today we have hospitals and they require large amounts of funding. And consequently, they require a large community around them to, well, not a large community, but a relatively sizable community to financially support that endeavor. And you see this wherever, in small towns around where I live, they're losing their local hospitals. And so everyone who has some kind of a chronic condition or everyone who has a sudden injury or something like that, a lot of those people are going to have to travel a lot farther to get the care that they need because their community fell apart. And so the idea here is like, well, what does this have to do with buying local? Maybe you can see the risk thing, but why does a hospital? What does that have to do with shopping at my local jewelry store or, going to the little mom and pop grocery store in my town? Well, the thing is, commerce builds community. The fact that people are operating with each other and helping each other implicitly and explicitly through through trade is a big part of what holds a community together. It's all well and good to have friendships and to volunteer together and things like that, but we all have to make a living and we have to be able to provide for our families. And so the fact that we're supporting each other in our local community is goes a long way to supporting supporting that community and holding it together, keeping it tight knit. And the tighter knit it is, the more likely it is that people are going to build social capital in that location, and they're going to want to stay, even even though you might come on hard times, and the culture might shift to some extent, and more people want to live in the city. They might see value in being in that community because there are bonds there that matter. And I wouldn't say it's just um, small local areas either. I think you can see this in cities that have kind of been hollowed out too. Um, Detroit's a good example. When commerce left and businesses left, it just implodes the community. So that commerce is there for a reason. It needs to be there to support that community. So all that being said, I would certainly grant that there are exceptions. If you live in North Dakota and you want to, eat a pineapple, there's really only one way to do that, and that is to ship those pineapples from somewhere else. And so, certainly, I would admit that trade gives us a larger variety of goods, but there's a point at which we might say that it's justifiable to trade away some of that variety for a greater amount of security, and to, from a moral standpoint, um, to serve our role, our duty to our community and our family. And of course, there would be other exceptions too. For instance, if you have in the town I live in here, there's a manufacturing company that builds these little trucks that move around shipping containers in shipping yards, and they're the largest producer, the largest company that produces these things in the country, and they are all produced at this location here. So, everybody who buys a little, truck for a shipping yard, if they don't live here, then they're not buying locally. So, but again, that's a totally different thing. That's a technological manufacturing type of good that, in one sense, you could just say that it doesn't matter as much from a buy local perspective, because it just has so much, it needs that scale. It needs to operate over a very large area for it to work. And that's just the way technology works now. Maybe you think, we could do without some of this technology, fine. But again, it's a trade-off that I think, of course, we need to be a little more mindful of than we probably are. But it's a trade-off that I think is potentially okay. So I want to get into the practical part of this, because I think a lot of us can get this idea in our heads that, well, we should just do away with large companies or multinationals or things like this. And I think the mistake there isn't just believing that can happen, as I just don't think it can. Certain things are baked into the cake, and you can't unbake it. And so then the question is, well, how do I deal with that now? What sort of attitude should I take to these large companies that have a foothold in my community and are, increasingly providing services to me or goods, and sort of eliminating the possibility of a smaller type of institution operating there. And so I think it becomes sort of about preservation. And if we're thinking about this from a fatherhood perspective, we're one of our biggest concerns is we want, of course, our family to thrive in the moment, but we also want to preserve things for them for later on. And in addition to ensuring that we preserve cultural institutions for them and community and things like that. We also need to find ways to preserve sort of economic resources as well. And so, what I would say is that when we think about a large multinational firm, take Walmart, for example, one that's often vilified, um, is to just think about the fact that that franchise, or I guess not franchise in one case of Walmart, that that company, that local building there with those products in it matters for your community too. The people who manage that Walmart, um, you know, obviously they feel like that's the best job they can find at the time, and the other employees there, because I think this sort of gets to sort of what's the alternative. Um, so you have this institution or this firm that's here that is quite large and maybe doesn't have the right incentives in place to serve your community the way you think it should. But what is the alternative? If it leaves, will that necessarily result in um, smaller or more locally managed or more locally owned businesses filling the gap? Um, and and I think that the answer is probably not. I think the only time you see that type of thing is sort of in the gentrification of these very well-to-do suburbs, where these little niche shops open up with incredibly high-priced, high-margin goods, and things like that. So, in your average small town or in your average sort of relatively small community urban area, um, I think you just have to take a little bit more of a practical view to these things and just realize that the best thing to do at this point is to um, understand that that large multinational firm um, has some kind of sway over the future of your community. And the best thing to do is to say, okay, here's what I have, and let me find a way to support this thing and influence its management to the extent that I can, in the sense that it will benefit the community, the broader community. Um, and so, I think my example where I live here, we have a Walmart with a grocery section, and then we have a large, relatively large grocery store that's also part of a big chain. And I mean, those are just the places I can go. And again, I believe the grocery store chain is more of a franchise type of thing. So to an extent, I'm supporting the franchise owner who probably has some kind of philanthropic relationship with my community. So that's a good thing. But again, I think we can get into this ideal world where we're arguing about ideal theories and things like that. But the best thing to do, I think, is just to look at, okay, what is the real alternative you have? And if these large multinationals go away, does your community just fall apart, or does it go back to its sort of former glory, quote unquote? And I'm just not really confident about that latter one. So I think to kind of wrap up, and this is a pretty short episode, but I think the last thing I would say from a practical standpoint is, again, when we're thinking about fatherhood, we're thinking about providing for our family, and we're thinking about sort of the future that our kids are going to grow up in, and how that community is going to help them develop into adults with good morals and the ability to prosper in all of the different ways that they can. It's just to realize that your community has inherent value. It really saddens me when I see these small towns just sort of dry up and blow away in the wind, because the people that are there didn't maintain these ties. They didn't make sure that their children understood the importance of saying supports. Some kids are always just going to rebel and run away or whatever, but to some extent, some of them would come back, or more of them might stay if they were offered an argument about the inherent value of your community. And of course, I think, to a large extent, the only way you can really do that is to reject a lot of the sort of more popular arguments about individualism and the sort of American dream perspective, and to think more communally about the people who live around you and the people who are supporting you and supporting your family in all the ways that we do that. But there is inherent value in your community. There just is. It is the very first unit above the family that holds the family together. And I just think that's so important to think about the reality that there is value there. And whenever you hear these arguments about buying local being silly or dumb or ignorant or whatever, I think maybe some of this can help you sort of formulate a response to that makes sense and helps people understand that once you start going out of this sort of very theoretical world where there's no morality and there's no sort of community and there's no risk, when we start adding those sort of more realistic variables to the situation, it becomes a lot more clear that that community matters, and that buying local is a very, very good idea in a lot of circumstances. And so with that, I appreciate all of you listening, and I hope you'll join us again.
Thanks for listening to the Trad Dads podcast. If you enjoyed our show, please subscribe on your favorite podcast app and consider giving us a 5-star rating on iTunes. It really helps us out.
The podcast you just heard was made using Anchor. Ever thought about making your own podcast? Anchor makes it really easy for anyone to get started. It's a one-stop shop for recording, hosting, and distributing podcasts. Best of all, it's 100% free. Sign up now at anchor.fm/new. That's anchor.fm/new to get started.